Hello, everyone. So thank you for joining me on this symposium on translingual words in social media. My name is Jiun Keo, and I'm Professor of Korean Linguistics in University of Oxford. I'm particularly interested in my research interest is in interaction between Asian words or like Korean words and English words, and how actually the interaction creates a new variety of English words which I labeled as translingual words. And I will particularly talk about today sort of the birth of translingual words and the role of social media in terms of like, making those words, translingual words, life active and diverse. So particularly, we'll start with some of the Korean wave words, Hallyu, which I called Hallyu words. So last year, 26 Korean words entered into OED, and most of them are basically to do with Hallyu, Korean wave, Korean drama and film, and Korean food actually made these certain words very popular, and they entered OED. So I kind of introduce some of those words, and then I'll talk about the translingual words. Is it Korean word, English word, or Japanese word? What is it? So I'll kind of introduce you this framework which I developed called translingual words, and the model, sunflower model, and so on. And social media and culinary words, how social media is so active in terms of like creating, circulating those culinary words in English language. And that would be, and then I'll talk about some of the future of these translingual words as conclusion. So yeah, as last year we had this a lot of media attention about this Hallyu words in English. 26 words entered into OED, Korean words entered into OED, but somehow, like no, those are many words that entered into OED. Of course, there are some traditional Korean words, but then also kind of the words that probably Koreans would have feel surprised. Words like Mukbang and Chime and 대박. These words not yet in Korean dictionary, any of Korean dictionary. And some people, Korean people, don't know of these words. And plus, some people are very much hesitant about these words because, as I'll talk about today, these were not necessarily what they often call pure Korean words. In Korean lexicon, you have like the way how lexicographers in Korea classify the words: pure Korean words, Anglo-Korean words, Sino-Korean words. In the dictionary so far, like 60 or 70, in the standard Korean dictionary, about 70% of the Korean words are Sino-Korean words, and then we have some what they call pure or native Korean words. And in the dictionary-wise, we have only 10% Anglo-Korean words. But in reality, which I discussed in my book 2014, in reality, in everyday life, the word that we commonly use have so much Englishness, the fragments of English. But of course, the way how we use English is very different. Words are different from how it is. So it's, sort of like English hybrid words, such like Chime. So Koreans are kind of really good at making new words and producing a lot of words. Every year they produce a report, like a new words report. I don't think I've seen that in the English side, but Koreans have like new reports of new words, and a lot of them sort of, you can imagine, like, they maybe just used a few years and then this will disappear. But also at the same time, a lot of them stay and remain. And not only within Korean context, some of the words actually started to go abroad, go out. And one of the things that happened, particularly last 20 years and last 10 years in particular, were this Korean drama and Korean film and Korean content, Korean culture becoming a very much popular culture, popular across the globe, and then started to be enjoyed by the world population, global population. And as a result, these words started to be used in non-Korean context. And chimek is one, chimek is one of those words. Like chimek, let me just show you the image first. Chimek is a Korean fried chicken. There are two kinds of chicken in Korea. One is the kind of fried chicken, they call it, and then the other one is yangnyeom chicken, which is like looking like this, sort of a spicy but sweet spicy sauce, and it's a bit sticky as well, but it's very popular. And chi is from chicken, and mek is from 맥주, which is a Sino-Korean word meaning beer. So chimek. Most Korean words two syllable in the dictionary, you know, like two syllable words are dominant. And so one of the things that you will very often recognize when you meet Korean people, their first name often two syllable. You know, I can tell you like 8 out of 10 would have two syllables. So Korean people, the way how they make words, like whatever, you know, English was entering into their mind, they try to make it two words, like they chop it, they a lot of time abbreviates and make two words, and the kind of use of blending, like a bit of Korean, a bit of Chinese, a bit of Korean and English all together, and they make words that could be very useful in Korean context. And chimek is one of these words that's kind of, you know, when chimek entered the OED, and that's the day when everybody, and particularly the day when we talk about this 26 words in OED were the Hangul, which is Korean Alphabet Day, where they were actually promoting the purity and authenticity of Hangul. At the same time, they were, you know, talking about the chimek, you know, entering OED. So kind of two messages, because chimek in one sense is not purely Korean, it's not purely English, it's kind of a hybrid word. And I think these words really represent something like, you know, what is happening in this world. You can't actually very easily kind of tell the identity of this word as Korean word, English word, or Chinese word, because it's Sino-Korean bits. But this is, chimek is not in English, Korean dictionary, but not in Chinese dictionary. Chimek is in English dictionary, Oxford English Dictionary. So it's the identity somehow, you know, in terms of word, its citizenship is in English, but it has a bit of in terms of word heritage, it has Korean, it has, but in chi, is it Korean? Koreans, you also chicken adopted, you know, the way how Koreans use chicken as because we have the word 닭, which means chicken. So people use chicken when they cook chicken in the Western way, particularly in a fried chicken way. So in a way, chi, is it again like from Korean or English? So we can say like, we're not sure, like it's the layers of culture, layers of word heritage all mixed up together and produce this word, and is used popular worldwide and is entered the OED. And I think it tells quite a lot about, you know, the identity of words in our time. And in very much so, this whole translingual world, translingual project, translingual lexicon idea kind of came up from me looking at my own identity. I'm Korean, but I've lived in UK 20 years. You know, every day I speak in English more than Korean, and who am I? And then I was looking at my friends, my colleagues, my students. Somehow, because living in England, you know, we communicate in English, but our heritage is all different and all very much complex and diverse, almost, you know, like super diverse. You know, we talk about super diversity, but, you know, very much so difficult to pin down into one nation state language identity. So in a way, again, like when you go back to chimek, at 26 words in Oxford English Korean words, but I would almost say it's not like say Korean words, but I would just say Korean wave words. It's the kind of most of them, not of course there are different words, but sort of Korean origin words, the words with Korean heritage, but you know, it may not necessarily be just Korean words. And yeah, it tells quite a lot about the hybridity, complexity, and interaction, and also makes us think about our own identity. And I guess, like, you know, more words would be used in the future in world English. One thing about this K-fandom, K-wave fandom, is they are very much like active in social media. They share Instagram, the photos, their recipes, and, you know, and one of the things that also, you know, so that in a way that word circulates very, very easily. probably in the past, when you're more like relying on newspaper articles or books in terms of like searching words, the speed may not be so much fast. But nowadays, social media, I remember like when Parasite was released, that suddenly so many people were like interested in Korean culture, and they were also looking up different words, how to say these words in English, what is the meaning, and so on. So like people really want to become very interesting. But then the thing I want to mention is that the interest and sudden interest, and like popularity, people writing about it, all happened within a month of the Parasite. It didn't take a year, it didn't take a month, but within a month, there was such popularity. So in a way, again, kind of going back to this idea of social media being so, in a way, crucial in terms of word circulation, sharing. It's very much a new thing in our time, and I guess this will be more of the case. And in this social media culture, which is kind of affecting more like global language and culture, that probably nation state branding of a word would be somehow would disappear in our time in the future, in near future. It's what I kind of think. Mukbang and Chime. When I first these are also words that entered OED, and when I first heard this word, I couldn't recognize this word because they said mukbang, and what is mukbang? I didn't really know what mukbang is. And basically mukbang is the broadcast. You eat food, enjoy food, you share it, how delicious you eat. So it costs, some people say, but it's kind of really popular. Like you basically enjoy food with other people, and people can enjoy not only the food and recipe or cooking show, but these days people enjoy like watching other people eating delicious food. So it's called mukbang. But somehow it's mukbang, whereas in Korean orthography it would be MEOK, mukbang, according to Korean romanization principle, because all sound is kind of in this romanized convention should be EO. So Korean, not only this word is not in Korean dictionary, but Koreans would most likely romanize this word into MEOK. But in OED, it's mukbang. This tells us quite a lot, because all sound in Korean language is very much not common across linguistically. All sound is very rare and difficult to romanize, therefore. And so all very often romanize EO, but many people, most sort of ab initio Korean learners or viewers would recognize U is most close to O, EO. And the EO is also in English spelling. It's not very natural. So many people romanize EO, O sound into U sound, which is phonetically more close and more popular form. So then mukbang became most popular, not mukbang, but mukbang. So people then look at this word mukbang, and then people who do not know Korean language start talking about mukbang. And I heard this mukbang sound in some British and American program, people talking about mukbang. And one can say, well, this is not mukbang, it's mukbang. But then also it brings an important question about identity. Whether mukbang is Korean word. Again, as I said, Koreans would not necessarily say mukbang is Korean word. But somehow this word became popularized and used by the global citizen, and the way how they perceive the meaning-wise and the form-wise, pronunciation-wise was mukbang. And then it's the and this is the word how the Oxford English Dictionary picked up as its form. And I think it's again like tells us that Korean linguistic authority would not agree with this romanization or pronunciation, but what matters is how the consumers, how the English users who actually across globe would use and write, and that matters, and that in a way gives a new identity, which again goes beyond the nation state language barrier. So mukbang, I say the English word, but also I would say, according to my theory, global words, translingual words that somehow is mediated by English language, but not necessarily just Korean English language, has Korean heritage because it has been born in Korean culture, but then not necessarily what Koreans often label as pure Korean. So it kind of shows these words, show the kind of the future of our English lexicon, how it would be like is so many foreign words, but all new culture words, these words will be mediated in English language, but in terms of their identity and the forms, and the meanings will be all like added in a very innovative way that we have not experienced before by the social media users across the world. And they will be very much active word makers and the active lexicographers in one sense. And Chime, many food words. Again, like why many food words? Why so many Korean food words in OED or English language? And I think it's drama and K-drama and K-film played important role. If you read a book, of course you see those words and you can kind of imagine what that means. But so many people, I mean, from 2014 onwards, many Korean words been many Korean novels or books being published more than ever before. But drama and film influx is much more than those books. And very often when you watch drama and you see Korean drama, you see so many people eat and talk. Eating, cooking is very much featured in those dramas, and people can see. And so you don't need to explain. You can see it, and what would be like contemporary Korean food eating culture. You can learn from the dramas and films, and also a lot of times, importantly, which I mentioned before in my talk, these words actually live as a sound footage. Many of times, these food words, which appear a lot of times, or address terms, these are very much like Korean words, would not necessarily become visible in other form of text. But these words actually always, you can hear it. And then those words actually live as a sound footage. People remember those words after watching a whole series of drama. And these words, and then once you remember those sound footage, you kind of start using those words using your own romanization, and then this is the way how these words become visual. So again, like going back to my original what I said, this kind of media, drama, and film, social media all together play a very important role in terms of bringing the words of diverse origin to life. And the Tagona coffee, I don't know how many of you have known this word Tagona. Tagona is something that I experienced when I was a kid. Not in a very positive context. It's something like snack that you have after school, but it was not like anything special. And the thing is, many Koreans do not know the meaning of Tagona either. So there are like a lot of theories that Tagona could mean this and that, but suddenly Tagona again became super popular, particularly lockdown time. And people put again recipes about Tagona, how to make Tagona coffee, and BBC featured Tagona coffee recipes and so on, and became super popular. Korean people not know why this is so popular, but again, like it's and when you think about this Tagona, how do we analyze etymologically Tagona? We don't know. It's somehow kind of, I would almost think about this as like folk etymology. We don't really know, but it somehow ended up, we have this word. We know that's first kind of the clear link between this Tagona coffee, Tagona, and Korean link. But Tagona itself doesn't have any so much, the so-called Koreanness in it. So again, like it shows that the words could be made, a lot of interaction, sometimes accidentally, that we, in a way that we haven't kind of expected, but it could come. Again, when you think about Tagona coffee, the identity, you can't really clearly think, is it Korean word or English word? Somehow it maybe become more difficult to capture the identity of this word. And so translingual words, is it those words, are these Korean words or English words? Or like, of course, these words could be used in non-English contexts, other European language contexts or Asian contexts. What are these words? And my idea is that these are the kind of translingual words. So like it kind of the more as we globalize the words, that we will be able to interact more with the different words with different origins, and somehow like we will end up the words that difficult to pin down one nation state identity, but create a new generation of words, which I would call translingual words. And in a way, when you think about the translingual words, it also applies very easily, I think, our own identity, not necessarily Korean or English. My daughter often talks about that I'm 6, she is, like a quarter of Danish and Korean and Scottish. So who am I? The same question we can ask to the words. What is this word? Who am I? As kind of we all in this super diverse, also super digital era, what we realized that we all become with a different heritage, of course, but translingual become translingual and transcultural and transnational by definition. Translingual words live at the borders of language, constantly traveling and resettling different languages, gaining subtle new meanings in the process. As we know, like, same word, same form, but when it goes to the another context, the meanings and forms all change, and it's natural to do so. You can't be the same. And it's a bit like our own selves. I'm Korean. I'm but and I'm in England. I'm my meanings or my life could be different. So in a way, we are very much the word itself sensitive to the given context, and in a way, so this is sort of the model that I came up how translingual was made. In James Morris model, foreign words, hybrid words, subcultural words, very much like conventional thinking. These words, foreign, hybrid, subcultural words, we kind of expected these words would be the dominant major words. But what I'm noticing and constantly observing is that those foreign words, subcultural, hybrid words, constantly giving input into our lexicon, and which is kind of turning into translingual and global, used by the global people. There's no, in this COVID online era, there's no like much boundary now. Virtually, we can be anywhere. So in a way, globally, the words can be circulated any moment. And these words are becoming constantly gaining the new identity as translingual words and transcultural words. And so like, layers of meanings, So as the word travels, it can have layers meaning. It can have a local meaning, but also, the meanings are constantly localized, although the kind of the basic forms and meanings would be contained as a core meaning, but then it will be added again and again. And so, same word, through this interaction would have layers of meanings and identities. And it's, again, very simple to think this is our own identity, our own lives. And so I have come up with this model in my book, 2018 book, Translingual Words. So the more we interact, in a way, the more we, and this can be like language or word interaction, but in a way, the more we interact, the worse, in a more interactive situation context, what happens is that the commonality will grow. The more people will now know about Korean food words than ever globally. So commonality would grow. The common lexicon will grow. People will know what we talk about. Many times in the COVID time, people did not translate the words. They used the words as it is. And now, a few days ago, I read a newspaper article in Korea, in Korean. Kind of they were talking about beyond the corona without translation. So kind of no translation, just presented as it is, and assuming that people would understand. So it was a bit strange, but like people sort of common vocabulary grow a lot because of the interaction. But at the same time, what happens is that diversity will grow too. Just like the sunflower grows and the core part will grow. But at the same time, the more interaction, there'll be more like more petals, more diverse, the language and culture will become known. So more like social, like idiolect, the words would appear. So, like we will experience huge interactive lexicon wherever we are. But this is kind of the model that I come up with. So, as time passed by and the more interaction, more globalization, we won't speak the same language. English being lingua franca, impacting every corner of the globe. more global lexicon, common words, more the commonality will grow, but it doesn't mean everybody speak the same language there, but we'll have a lot of diversity like the sunflower. And that was the idea. And so again, like as you can see, the more interaction actually commonality will grow, but also diversity at the same time will grow too. So that was the idea. And Translingual was we have to kind of shift our idea with this view, thinking about monolingual lexicon into more dynamic multilingual lexicon model in order to accommodate our very much flexible, fluid, and multifaceted nature of translingual words in our global lexicon. So we have to have very much interactive view, dynamic lexical model to cope with these words. And one of the things like we often talk about loan words and borrowing, or like very much like, so, you can think about this lexical interaction from one dimension, but this would again like make less sense in the future because of so much interaction. Who is borrowing what? It will be when you think about Chime and Mukbang, who is borrowing what? It's kind of difficult. Whose words are these words? It's so complex and diverse, but these are words like Mukbang and Chime are not like some minor words, but so many words will come up with words like that. So we can't really pin down their identity, but very much popular. And this is the word that somehow we're not sure who made these words, but these are the words for actively circulated throughout globally by these social media users. So I don't think they will one day will disappear, but we will face more of these words every day. This hybrid words, or somehow sort of have English forms in Romanized form, but not necessarily English word, but would show different trans cultural entity, some sort. And large-scale lexicon encounters between English and other languages will somehow Asian languages and English interaction relatively late. The interaction encounters happen relatively late, but it's now happening in a very much the interaction is very active, and we can also see not only Asian, and the more English becoming a lingua franca, the more interaction and this the varieties of English words we will come across that could be used in the local context, but also because of social media could be transported into the global context and the global translingual words. And this, but this question actually about what is the English word, as we all know that James Murray asked this question, how do we define true English words? And that was the, of course, at the beginning of 20th century, when he was collecting all these words, he had this issue, he had this question, how to define the English word, how we cope with these foreign words, how can we bring the identity of this word. So he asked this question, but I think nowadays in 21st century, we see it more like the reality of this question, looking at the word like Chimeg and Mukbang, where does this words belong to? So we can kind of see that this was not actually the question we only have now, but it has been a question over and over again. Again, English language, how do we define it as his question? But again, like we can think, how do we define English words? How do we define Korean words? How do we define Japanese words? It's very difficult, given that we are so much in the culture and language, so much interwoven, and so many culinary words. I wrote the book in 2019, Delicious Words, kind of shows, well, it's impossible to pin down one food word into one nation state. To give one nation state identity. So as I said, the social media is really the important word carriers and spreading the word, and in a way the sunflower model, the way how interaction, formation, creation, circulation nowadays and more would be shared by the social media, would be done by the social media. And I can skip this one. And again, like so many food words, this different kind of dumpling word. See, as you mentioned, 2 days ago, Chinese New Year, Korean New Year's Day, many people make dumpling. Not like just dumpling, one word. You see like gyoza and mandu, and so dim sum, so many words. And actually, what I found is that many culture has the word. Most of the Asian culture, but also European, they have this dumpling is not like this one type of dumpling. There are all kinds of dumpling, and there are different authentic words that refer to dumpling. And what is interesting is now that people know more words of dumpling. I mean, dumpling is not like one sort, but many sorts. Initially, when in early 20th century, people didn't think about this dumpling. But nowadays, if you Google image dumpling, you will see actually these images. So this is kind of people imagine as dumpling, whereas this was not the case in the early 20th century. So in a way, more people know the dumpling now. And at the same time, so many different words that refer to dumpling is also known. So again, as I said, commonality, diversity grow together hand in hand. And like think about English language. I don't have to emphasize about this. It's kind of power to observe all different words. In a way, I think English provides a good settling ground for those words. And but just looking at some of the words that we are very famous, we eat, bacon, broccoli, carrot, and so on. Yogurt, tomato, potato, noodle is German origin according to OED, ketchup, coffee, chutney, whatever we eat, all the food and drinks we eat has some kind of foreign origin. So I kind of again wonder, what is English food? Tea, we know that this is from China. So marmalade from Greek, and noodle, chutney, chocolate. What is this called purely English? So again, what it shows is that it's difficult to define purely English or purely Italian, purely German. I mean, what we discuss is basically on English lexicon, but we can kind of, this argument, transcultural translingualism can be used in other lexicon, other languages too. Basically we are living in a very much globally, very much global time. Globally, everybody's life interwoven. So not much of a game point, even if we can find originally it's from this. Originally noodle is from German, German language, or tomato from or yogurt from Ottoman Turkish. Originally it's okay, but now everybody uses, and the people really don't think about feel any foreignness from these words. So it's kind of again like in the past maybe it must have taken a few years or few 100 years for this word to nativize and naturalize. But nowadays, because of social media, people don't really feel so much foreign. And also look around the people who we are living with. Everyone we are living with have some sort of different heritage. No, and same likewise when you look at the words. These words live with the words with all different foreign complex foreign heritages. So it's kind of difficult, not only difficult or impossible to define the language, the identity of these words into like one nation state language, and based on nation state criteria. So in a way, what again this shows is more or less translingual, transcultural trend in our time. But also, as I said, these words, it must have taken a long time, but now in the time of social media, it takes really little time for these, the words that we saw, like the word Chime and Mukbang. And maybe some people would find, I'm not very familiar with these words, but for also many people, these words becoming much more like common than ever before. Like, it's very faster in terms of these words becoming part of our lives. Just one very small thing about this Korean wave, very much so. K-pop, you can imagine like young people, but K-drama, so-called Korean drama, the people, the audience who are watching, viewers watching this drama, not necessarily particularly young people with certain generation, but according to my another research, very much like in terms of age and gender, there's not much like a particular group, very much widely enjoyed, which means these words would do somehow they would be able to remember, because they will have sound footage again we watch, and they will remember it, and then they will be able to somehow use these words in a particular context, and these words would be used in more, and they will be frequent, and then it will also somehow enter English language in this way, just like the other words. Yeah. So this is kind of the old way how we see the foreign words entered into OED. But I guess again, like nowadays, the way how, as I said, the way words enter into the English language and settle and live would be very much like, so not very some kind of elite people, or but it will be like more ordinary people's ordinary day life. And then they come across more of these words, and that would be circulated by the social media and will enter the English language. So the way how the words enter into our lexicon, the pattern would be very much different from these days compared to now. And yeah, again, this shows some early Asian words entered. Again, you see, like very much like but it's interesting, these words very much so people, when I ask them, what do you think these words, the identity of these words, many people say, okay, sake, Japanese, anime, Japanese, so have more like a close link between sort of the origin culture, origin language and the word, whereas nowadays people don't have that very much clear link. Again, because nowadays we live in a transcultural era where what is Japanese, what is Korean, it's all kind of mixed in the contemporary era. So very much so, people don't really people not really able to tell the clear link, but this was the case in the past. And yeah, again, like this is one example of a salad. To show, salad very much in my time. Salad was like a salad with mayonnaise, or in the left image was, my image of salad. But now, and then we call it sort of Japanese version. So I call it harada, so it was salad. But now we only also have salad, which is, the salad that you normally would think as salad. So what I'm saying is that basically, again, my vocabulary, there's a salada and salad, and so much, it's diversity. So the commonality grows, but also there's different varieties. Not only one word for one item, but you can have more, and it's individually tailor-made lexicon could be created, and one's lexicon could be more enriched through this lexical interaction. And there's more, and the branding is another very, very interesting thing. Like sometimes the words, if you go to some restaurants, even supermarket, you will see like this branding, like the word that becomes so popular that everybody knows and then use it. But anyway, this word is not made by particular lexicographer or like some people, journalists, or like, but they were kind of born out through branding. So it's again like how these kind of international companies, particularly these food companies, will come up with such hybrid culinary terms, and that would be very interesting, because also those words would be very quickly circulate globally. So kind of again, like when you think about this ownership, who owns this word, who makes the words, not like necessarily nation state or like linguistic authorities, but individuals, or or sometimes accidentally could be born, but sometimes also these companies, big companies, could create some words and do those branding. So as a sort of making new brand. So all this kind of, what I'm saying is like the root would be very different. So like diverse roots, and through these diverse roots all these words will come up, and then with the people's use and their popularity and frequency, based on that actual use, some words will survive and thrive, and those words that survive and thrive will enter into English language and will be used and enjoyed equally by the people globally. Also, there are words that will be more like specifically used, more specific registrar rather than common registrar. Again, going back to the sunflower model. So the more words that sort of survive and thrive would be there for the common use, but at the same time, there will be like diverse options around too. So in a way, when you kind of thinking about the lexicon and language in the future, again, like, you know, like nation state sort of identity, nation state definition would do more or less will disappear. And my kind of prediction would be like English being more like lingua franca would create what it means like English, not like necessarily assuming everybody speaks the English that we know, but it will be like more or less we will create sort of more common lexicons with translingual identities and that people can use and communicate. And that along with very much diverse lexical, individualized lexicons. So I think that could be some kind of feature of our lexicon based on what I my this sunflower model. So yeah, as I said, social media will play a more important role, and along with other roots, and that would really change our linguistic atmosphere and future. Again, like going back to my original question, who, you know, is it Korean word, is English word, or it will be like translingual words that mediated by English language, and that is my answer. Thank you so much for listening to me, and I think that's everything from me.